You have beautiful eyes, huh?
Thank you.
And great presence. Great.
Dear Ty, dear friends, I've been asked to share a little bit about the path of addiction and the path of recovery and how the Plum Village tradition has helped me to continue the work of healing and freedom. And I'll start by saying that I'm the youngest of three brothers, and I grew up in an affluent family where I was provided for and always had clothing and never missed a meal. So the path to addiction wasn't out of poverty and so much societal conditions of me feeling oppressed. It was rather that my dad, as a doctor, every little message pad in the house was from a pharmaceutical company. My older brother was a drug addict and kind of growing up in the 60s, he was taking hallucinogens and various drugs. And to me, it very much was a path of spirit, a path of awakening. And just an anecdote, when I was in school, my dad let me use a ruler, and it had 13 inches instead of 12. And the slogan on it was codeine for the added measure of relief. So I was kind of indoctrinated in a culture where drugs are a solution. Drugs are a way of living. And rock and roll in that period was all about drugs. Jefferson Airplane, Rolling Stones, everything was about drugs, drugs, drugs. And I had a lot of fun for a long time. I've come to think that when drugs were working, and what I mean by working, making me feel in a certain way, feel good, that it was a close approximation of what I think of as spiritual fitness now. That I was comfortable in my own skin, I wasn't too preoccupied with what you thought of me or if I fit in or not. I felt really pretty okay with the world. Sadly, what happens for those of us who are drug addicts is the dynamic changes, and we don't get the same results from the same substances after a while. The body builds tolerances, and of course, if it feels good once, then I want to do it more, you know. So when I was 13 years old, I was the first drug bust at my junior high school, and my parents shipped me off to a all-boys boarding school, and still thinking that drugs were my life's calling, I was thrown out of the boarding school before I finished a term and went in my first rehabilitation center, a long-term rehabilitation center. It wasn't that I had any desire to stop using. It was that I had nowhere else to go because I was thrown out of my house, family. And I met a lot of wonderful people, including jazz musicians and actors and actresses, and I loved being around con artists and dope fiends. And
But that was at the age of 13.
14, April 1968. I was there for almost a year and a half, and then I managed to escape. So I mentioned that just as a way of framing that I started to have, using drugs were creating conditions that were leading to suffering in my life and upheaval, going back to a long time ago. But I didn't have the capacity to see drugs as anything but a solution. I couldn't really recognize that it was using that was the problem and creating disturbances. So long story short, well, no long story short, and I hope you edit some of this stuff. Sorry to make work for you. I started playing music. I'd played clarinet in band in junior high, and I started playing music because it was something that I could do. I could get high and play music, and it was culturally acceptable in the music circles. And I became a successful jazz musician with tours and recordings and international. And but as is the problem with drug addiction. After a while, the music stopped being the primary focus of my life, and when it flipped to, once again, where narcotics were more important, my music career fell to pieces like everything else had. So I lost the capacity to go on tour. I lost instruments to the pawn shops. And where drugs, in the beginning, I could get high and practice for 6 or 8 hours a day and really put in the hours of focus. And there, I felt like it was self-medicating. It was a way of quieting my internal dialogue when I performed, where I could stop the discriminative, noisy mind. But sadly, the repercussions of that led to a state of pretty pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization, a state of financial poverty, physical poverty, and spiritual poverty. And I tried to get clean a number of ways, and I was in and out of rehabs and mental institutions and drug programs, incarcarated as a result of what I found it necessary to do to continue to use in the way that I wanted to or felt I had to. And it was in 1985 that I was locked up and I got out of prison and found out that my older brother had shot himself. And Richard and I had a very troubled relationship. He was my hero in a lot of ways, and we hadn't spoken for years. And he was an addict, and I have come to believe that suicide was the only way that he finally knew how to surrender, how to let go, how to stop the fight. That was his way out. That was the only way that he knew of to surrender. And I had been completely cut off from my family. So they didn't know I was incarcerated or where. They didn't want anything to do with me because of the chaos, mayhem, and suffering I'd caused my family. Because addiction is a family disease. We're sending ripples of insanity into our communities. I used to justify it and think that heroin addicts were good for the society because everything we stole had to be replaced, so it was perpetuating a capitalist system of more consumption. But obviously that was a rationalization, and nothing to do with my real motive. So when I got out in December of 1985, I had already tried to clean up for years and couldn't do it. I'd been in and out of 12-step programs, and I just didn't feel like I belonged. I felt like a tourist. They could tell me everything that I needed to do to stay clean except how to surrender, and I didn't know how to let go. I didn't know how to surrender. And finally, after I got out of prison the last time, I wound up living in my little Pinto, and I'm 6'2" and sleeping and living in my Pinto with everything I own. I'd lost my instruments. It wasn't partying because we didn't have cell phones, so it wasn't like people were calling. I never knew where I was parking, so nobody was knocking on the door, and I was a mess. Nobody wanted much to do with me. I had caught convictions. I'd been arrested for 2 more felonies since I got out of prison. And it was in court Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve in 1985. Feeling very lonely and despondent and really kind of wanting to go back to prison where I could at least have a bed and meals and a very clear way of how to function there institutionally. And I was in my Pinto and had what's called a moment of awakening. And this is kind of an important theme. I woke up in my Pinto on January 4th, and I was parked somewhere in Culver City. And I was sick, and I had no money, and I didn't know how to get well. And I had a gun, and I'd been doing some armed robberies. And I thought about what crime I could commit to get enough money to get some narcotics to be okay, not sick anymore. And I had a moment where the feelings of loneliness and fear and despair and despondency were unavoidable. And in that moment, I can remember what it felt like, what it tasted like. I can remember the feeling like every pore on my arms were open as I was a little dope sick. I remember the pit of my stomach and the tightness in my chest. It was a full embodied experience of an emotional and physical bottom. And I had that moment of awakening where I realized this is like this because this is the end result of using. That to use is not happiness, pleasure any longer. This is the end result of using. And this is Buddhist teaching. This is like this because that is like that. I didn't know it, but I was starting to see as a Buddha and connect causes and conditions with what's manifesting. As an addict, I wanted to feel one feeling all the time. I wanted euphoria all the time. I wanted bliss all the time. And any reasonable adult knows that's not possible. And certainly any Buddhist knows that euphoria doesn't exist as a separate state from everything else in reality. So in that moment when I realized that this is the result of using, and the loneliness and the fear, the despair were really unavoidable, I knew that I not only needed to stop, because I'd known I couldn't go on and needed to stop for years, but this was the point of surrender where I realized that drugs were no longer had anything that I wanted anymore. That drugs were no longer a solution for me. And that moment of suffering has become a resource that's informed my life for 36 years that I've been clean now. Not just a resource of why I don't ever want to get loaded again, because I need to say there's times where the thought of a beer or a cocktail or some legal marijuana or one of the psychedelics that are pretty legal these days sounds attractive, but to remember very deeply what the end result is. It's a clarity that there's nothing that I need from the outside to take to make me okay inside. That if I'm going to be okay inside, it happens from the inside out. And our teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, says the way out is in, and this is like a very clear example of that manifesting. So I was ready to ask for help, and for the first time, it wasn't about giving up anything that I wanted. See, before I knew I needed to stop, but secretly that's what I really wanted was to get high and feel like I used to. And in that moment, I realized that I'm never going to feel that way again. That the past is gone, and this is the way it is right now. And I was able to reach out for help. I want to say that in my life of recovery as a clean addict and as a practitioner, over and over again, I am finding ways to engage with suffering, to embrace suffering, not as a victim, but as a participant, and finding that I don't have to be ruled by my feelings or ruled by my perceptions, that there's a way of noticing when I'm triggered, agitated, or suffering, that I can engage with compassion. And that's the path of learning to engage from the heart. We think, for years I thought that by focusing on the problem, which is that I'm a drug addict, it's illegal, that I don't have enough money, that drugs don't work the same, and the problem of how do I stop using, that was the way to finding healing. And what I want to share is that my experience is that dwelling on the problem only compounds the problem. And when I was able to just accept that this is the way things are, I could start focusing and dwelling on living and how I live. So freedom from addiction is not simply about not using. That's like the prerequisite. It's really about how am I living? How am I engaging with life? How am I relating with life? And I'm very grateful that there are paths and tools, including 12-step and the Dharma and Plum Village tradition in particular for me, that offer me a way of living and engaging with life where I can grow happiness and freedom by attending to the suffering rather than repressing it or outrunning it or denying it.
Okay.
We're rolling?
Yeah.
So my friend Phapde, he was a Dharma teacher, a monk in our tradition who's now passed on, was recovering alcoholic. He used to say that his first addiction was addiction to thinking. And it's addiction to dualistic thinking. And I have the kind of mind where I've been addicted to thinking, and thinking alone may not be the problem. It's a discriminative thinking. And it's kind of suggested that the roots of addiction are an unnatural preoccupation with self. So it's a kind of thinking where I'm seeing myself as separate and things happening to me, and do I fit in and don't I fit in, and what do I need to be okay? And what we begin to learn in recovery and in the practice is how to quiet the discriminating mind, how to settle and move from the head to the heart. When I'm agitated and I am still prone to anxiety and depression at times, I tend to ruminate on what's wrong and focus on the problem. Buddha offered solutions that were presented as antidotes, and Thai gave us antidotes for all of the afflictions and the challenges of living. And the first antidote is learning to stop and let go, learning how to come home to the breath, how to come home to the body. And there was a period where drugs were helping me quiet the dialogue and just be warmly in body, but it was an artificial and temporary solution. It was inherently had a half-life, okay, and wore off. So the path of practice that we have is a solution that continues to deepen and grow and flower as long as I keep nourishing it. It's a solution-based way of living that helps me to engage and practice antidotes for what arises rather than be a victim of them. It's a path of emancipation because I have the capacity to become mindfully aware and to engage from the heart. So I think of mindfulness practice as heartfulness practice. That when I'm stopped and settling, it's not that I've silenced my mind or that my mind is an enemy, because it's incredibly valuable and I appreciate my wonderful mind. But it's that my mind is now in balance with my heart, and it's not sweeping me away out of body, which is what I had sought, but it's helping me to be grounded and embodied so that I can respond rather than react more in life. Meditation practice is something that I used to think would bring me freedom from suffering, and I would try and sit for bliss states. And the way that we're taught to practice in this tradition, in my current understanding, which is subject to change, is by stopping and settling, I can ground in the conditions of well-being, but I use them as a basis for it, having spaciousness to handle suffering that arises. And in my own experience, meditation actually sensitizes me to ill-being. It sensitizes me to suffering as well as joys. And the beauty of that is I can be aware more aware, or have a chance of being aware, when my muscle tone and blood pressure are changing before I'm in full-blown anger. I'm sensitized to become aware of things that are not sitting right in my gut or heavy on my heart before I'm in depression or in a shame spiral, and have a way to let go for now and reestablish stability, solidity, and spaciousness, so that I can then care for rather than be victimized with the challenges in my internal formations, with reactive states of nervous system. So this is very much, I see this very much as a path of healing. And if anything, mindfulness and practice gives me a capacity to be with suffering in a way that's meaningful and beneficial, rather than eradicating suffering from my life, at least at this point. And maybe there's a chance that I can transcend all suffering at some point, and there are maybe holy beings who have done that. But for now, I think that afflictions cease to be afflictions when they're an invitation to love. And I never dreamed that I could be a friend to my own uncomfortable emotive states, that I could be a friend to despair, that I could be learn how to touch fear with love. And I've learned that by showing up for life, but also being very clear about how I want to live, what a life of meaning and value is for me, which means that it goes like this. I was clean and sober for 15 years when my stepson David died suddenly. He was 17 years old. And my first thought was, why did this happen to me? I'm living a good life. I'm responsible. I'm a good parent. I'm going to meetings. I'm helping others. I go into prisons to carry a message. I do all of these. Why did this happen to me? And it only took a little bit for me to realize, wait a minute, this isn't happening to me. This is happening. This happened to David, and I'm bearing witness to this. Learning how to care for grief has been a challenge and an inspiration, and one of the best teachers that I've had in the last few decades. Learning how to show up and sit with the grief and metabolize the grief so that I can honor the grief as a way of honoring the love that the grief's made of. And I know that this sounds a little intellectual, but as I practice grieving, I'll tell you a story. A very dear friend of mine had a incurable condition, and I spent the last month of his life with him. This was my mentor in recovery. Bedside with him, helping him, preparing for his death, and helping him prepare to die in a way that embodied some freedom, some acceptance. And he died. And the next day I was facilitating a men's retreat, as it happens. This was in Arizona. And I got a phone call the next morning that my dog had died suddenly. And I want to say I was prepared for my friend's death, but the dog's death was unprepared. And the two of them combined synergetically to just be completely overwhelming. And I would try and practice sitting meditation, and the weight on my chest was so heavy I didn't think I could breathe. And I remember inviting the bell, and I've been practicing inviting the bell and listening to the bell for many years. And in the moment when the bell sang and I showed up for the bell, I realized that the grief had gone. So this grief that's so overwhelming, that tells me it's who I am and all is grief, in that moment of listening to the bell, the grief was gone. And I didn't go with it, so I already knew that I'm more than the grief, The grief is here, but I'm more than the grief, okay? So I start to sit with grief and investigate the grief. What is this? Where is it in the body? What is it made of? And discover that grief is like this soup or a stew that's made of many ingredients. It's not one flavor. That an element of the grief is like, I'm not so much sad for them that he's out of chronic pain or that I don't think my dog is okay now. Well, okay, I'm sad for my loss. And by learning how to care for the feelings without the story, I come to discover the nature of inner being, that in the sadness, in the loss, if I look deeply, there's love. That the deep black shadow of grief is the shadow cast by the light of love. And that if it weren't for all of the moments of love and care and kindness that we did share, I wouldn't be as devastated by their passing as I felt. So this is Buddhism. This is non-dualism for me. That I can hold and care for the sadness, but also be aware the sadness is made of non-sadness elements. The grief's made of non-loss elements. That there can't be a loss unless there's been a gain. That gain and loss are two sides of a coin. And it gave me a way to feel the feelings and move with the grief where I could metabolize it, not deny it, not push it away, but also not need to amplify it as a way of honoring my loved ones who are no longer embodied in the way they were. And it became an invitation that emotions and perceptions can be so delusive, they're kind of primitive, where I thought that the depth of my grief proved the depth of my love, and that the grief was a way of loving, when really when I stop and recognize I'm sad because my friend's no longer here, then the question arose, what does my friend want from me? And of course my friend wants me to be happy, my friend wants me to enjoy life, my friend wants me to be vitally alive. So that the best way to make use of the grief is to internalize it and make it a resource that informs my way of living. That's what I learned when David died. And I came to the monastery because I wanted to figure out, how do I show up for life? My regret wasn't so much I wasn't abusive and I hadn't caused harms. My regret when David died is that I hadn't been more fully present in more moments. My regret was that I wouldn't have the opportunity to have a conversation or to hold him or be present with him in that way. So I forged this volition to learn how to be fully present in every moment. And this is what the depth of hitting bottom in my Pinot taught me. It's a way of reinforming my view of the way life is and my role and relationship to life. So sitting in the Pinot that day as a day of misery, where I was looking at the gun and figuring who I could stick up to get enough money to go get drugs to get well. And then the thought came, Pete, you're tired of all this, why don't you shoot yourself? And remembering that my brother Richard had shot himself a few months before. That moment that gave me clarity that this is the end result of using has shined light of clarity in many other areas where I think I'm having a bad day. Okay? I know what a bad day is. A bad day is being arrested and sleeping on the floor of the county jail, dope sick, detoxing, kicking heroin because they were overcrowded and didn't. That's a bad day. Being in my Pinot, completely alone and isolated and devastated, that's a bad day. So it's giving me a frame of reference that can reinform the challenges of life today. And when David died, as devastating as it was, there was a level of reality where at least I'm clean. If I was loaded, everything would only be worse. So in some ways, I had hoped to carry the message of recovery to my brother Richard and couldn't stay clean and do that. And Richard, in his own death, carried a message of life to me because I was somehow fortunate enough to show up and relate in that kind of a way. This is the Dharma. So the Four Noble Truths, there is suffering, but it's not the suffering that isolates and creates more suffering. It's the kind of suffering that we realize is containing the seed of freedom from suffering, that's pointing to where we engage with it directly in a way that we become informed of what conditions gave rise to this, that suffering and the cause of suffering, and that there's an end to suffering. And the end of growing suffering is the path of well-being. And for me, that's very much the path of spiritual maintenance, I call it, spiritual fitness, of stopping and calming and coming back to the heart and remembering where my life is most nobly oriented. And it's most nobly oriented to the path of goodwill and the ground of goodwill. In our tradition, the tenet of the Plum Village community, as I understand it, is I have arrived, I am home. And I think of this as stopping, and my body is my home, and I've arrived in this moment. But it's actually more than that for me. By stopping and breathing and releasing and being fully embodied, where I have a mindful body and an embodied mind, I've restored a condition of equanimity and balance and harmony that I think of as goodwill. I've come back to the capacity for open-heartedness and spaciousness. So this is the guiding light in my life. What is the medicine, the antidote that I may be in need of when there's challenges, and also very much as the fruit of practice and recovery, what is the medicine I can offer? And the medicine is that our freedom is not dependent on external conditions so much. There was a way to be free when I was incarcerated. There's a way to be free when I'm grieving. There's a way to be free, and with the great many health challenges that I've had. And the way of being free with them is non-dualism, not being focused on the problem and the limitations and what is not the way I want it to be, but by practicing a kind of radical acceptance. Breathing in, breathing out, dropping the shoulders, loosening the arms and legs, softening the tummy. This is just the way it is right now. And what if there's nothing that I need to manage, control, or change? How can I show up for this moment exactly the way it is right now, with my whole self, with freedom, with joy, as well as being a little chilly, sitting out here in the woods on a cold day and being camera shy, you know? So to me, this is the path. Being of the nature to have an addictive nature, I want to say that I have found myself addicted to anger. The addiction to anger is something that I still am working with at times, because there's a visceral response to perceived threats that's creating a flood of chemicals in my bloodstream that has me in fight, flight, freeze mode. So that feels empowering because I feel supercharged. And it also helps me feel like, I'm ready to dominate or something. And the addiction to anger is a real trap for me. So I'm very clear that what Thai has taught me, and what Buddha has shared with us, and what the monastics embody, is a path of stopping and calming and engaging rather than compounding tension. At the same time, where my practice really is and my spiritual development really is where there is friction. So the friction's a good thing. Where I'm rubbing up against something or I'm caught snagging on the edges of it, that's the invitation to really practice. That's the invitation. But again, Conditioning is deep, so I'm dealing not only with my personal karma, I'm dealing with ancestral karma, being of Jewish roots and many generations of persecution, many generations of disenfranchisement, generations of fear. I'm dealing with societal karma too. So what I realize is when I stub my toe, for example, and my first reaction is to say something nasty, to respond in anger, like, oh, blank, this is conditioning. The anger is conditioned as a response to pain. And my practice is to stop and recognize and soften and come home so that I can offer the balm of compassion and maybe hold the toe and calm myself. Or instead of calling myself names because I was forgetful or stubbed my toe on something, to stop and have a little bit of compassion and kindness for myself. So clarity has been developing over the 36 years that I've been free of intoxicants. And the Plum Village tradition is so harmonious because we practice freedom from intoxicants. We practice the 5 mindfulness trainings. And the 5 mindfulness trainings, which is one of today's greatest contributions to the world, are based in an awareness of suffering as a result of certain thoughts, words, and behaviors and actions. And that it's by the awareness of the suffering caused by that I deepen my understanding and can grow conditions for lessening that suffering in myself and the harm I cause others and the harm I'm creating in the world. This is something I never dreamed of, is how to make use of all the ingredients of life. And I can't do it all the time, but more and more of the time, I practice being grounded in my breath and remembering that I have a practice and remembering to come home to my heart. In 12-step rooms, they talk about addiction and alcoholism being a disease of forgetfulness. So I don't really want to talk about the disease concepts, but addicts and alcoholics are prone to forgetting exactly why we're doing all the things we're doing to follow a path away from active addiction and active alcoholism. And in this tradition, we practice the opposite of forgetfulness. We're practicing mindfulness. The Mahayana tradition is about learning to recognize, care for, and transform suffering, not solely for my own freedom, but so that I can be of greater value in helping others to care for suffering and transform suffering. And along with the mindfulness trainings, one of Thai's greatest contributions, I think, is the idea of Sangha building. And I very much take this to heart. I very much need a community, whether it's in a 12-step meeting and or in Buddhist practice, a Sangha, to keep reminding me where I want my life to be oriented and that I do have solutions and that I don't need to feed the illusion or delusion that I'm a separate self and that my suffering is really proof of my own unworthiness and inadequacy. Because when we go to meetings and sanghas and share heartfully, we are making it safe for others to have the same feelings. And this is a deep kind of connectiveness. So in 12-step, the 12th step is having had a spiritual awakening as a result of the prior steps. And I have given this great thought, what does it mean to have a spiritual awakening? Spiritual awakening for me, the barometer isn't that I have all universal knowledge and insight. Spiritual awakening is when my heart is open and I'm growing connection. Spiritual poverty is when I am isolated and separating. And disease is said to be a disease of separation. When I'm hurt, I immediately want to separate. I want to blame. I practice intolerance and all of these stories and notions. So having a community to practice with is vitally important. A community that I'm committed to going to if I feel like it or not. Because sometimes when I feel least like being in community is when I need it the most. So practicing non-harming, I know that having a Sangha and participating in Sangha is always non-harming. It's always non-harming. So the idea of creating Sangha to me is very precious. It's a way of honoring today's life, and it's a way of honoring what's most in my heart. So I have co-founded Buddhist Sanghas here in San Diego, and I also founded a 12-step Zen Sangha, where we're exploring the relationship between Buddhism and 12-step wisdom. And to me, it's endlessly fascinating how the wisdom contained in the 12 steps can help be a bridge to unpacking Buddha and Thay's teachings, and how the Dharma can be a bridge and help me revitalize and renew and refresh my practice and understanding of the 12 steps and engage them with new and deeper ways. So the idea of Sangha building is vitally important. The practice of deep listening in community is vitally important. Again, in 12th step, we say that the power of 12th step healing is one addict or alcoholic sharing with another. And Thay has taught me that it's not so much just the sharing, that's kind of dualistic. The power of our healing is listening compassionately, listening from the heart, as well as sharing from the heart. So Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of great compassion, is the Bodhisattva of deep listening. So when I'm practicing in community, it's an opportunity to practice listening meditation, recognizing the judging, discriminating mind, and letting go of it and coming back to the heart space to look for similarities instead of differences. And to be able to learn from our collective wisdom is such a great gift, because no matter where we are on the path, we have embodied wisdom. We all have Buddha nature. We all have the nature of recovery in us. I want to remind anybody who sees this that no matter what harms we've caused or what horrible deeds we have done, no matter what the shame is we carry, that every single person is worthy of freedom from addiction. Every single person has Buddha nature, has the nature of recovery, has the nature of freedom, has the nature and capacity to heal if we figure out how to get out of our own way, how to stop and surrender, how to dare to be vulnerable, how to create safe space and hold space for each other. And there's a lot of horrible things that we witness in the world. And these are some really depressing times with what's happening to the planet, on so many levels: earth justice, social justice, sexual justice, oppression, poverty, greed, patriarchy, domination. But this is also one of the very best of times, where the literacy rate is the highest. More of the world has internet access than ever before, where we have new medicines and new ways of healing. So I need the help of others to stay in balance and also to stay right-sized. We have a path where, and I'm going to be a little bit crude, and if you want to cut it, that's fine. But what I want to say is that we have a path where no matter what the shit is that may arise, no matter what the pain, suffering, and horrors that may arrive in our life, we have the means to care for them and compost it. And out of grief, out of illness, out of other dynamics in my life, I have come to realize that what we think of as poop is made of non-poop elements. That the poop is made out of the wonderful meal I had the night before, and that the poop of my suffering also can be composted, and if I know what I'm doing and how to care for it, it can become the fertilizer that nourishes and helps the garden, the flower of wisdom, the flower of happiness, the flower of our collective awakening bloom. So much of this is surrendering my ideas about the way things are. When Buddha talked about grasping and clinging as the root of suffering, it's not just physical grasping and clinging and greed, it's the way that I'm grasping at my understanding and I'm clinging to old perceptions. And many of these old perceptions are hardwired in, were coded in my computer from before I learned to think. And learning how to practice non-attachment to view and engage with curiosity and openness has helped me find my way in the world and end the war within. And in the end, my hope is to end the war within, to learn to recognize subtle negative self-talk. Sort of the mindfulness training about loving speech, that applies very much to my self-talk too. So learning to unpack and to hold and unravel and heal and care for and transform these afflictive states is an incredible superpower. And where I used to think that drugs were a superpower, I now think that compassionate and mindfulness are a superpower. They help me to be much more than limitations and help me not to be a victim in this world. They help me to engage in a way where I'm harmonizing. As a jazz musician, I recognize, and I play kind of free jazz, but I recognize that either everything is music or everything is noise. And I choose to live in a way where everything is music. A wise man once said that either everything is medicine or everything is disease. And with the path and the help of the Sangha and the community, I learned to live in a way where everything is medicine, where everything is healing, and whatever I'm bumping up again is an invitation, where every breath is validating my worthiness, no matter that when a feeling of shame arises, it doesn't mean I'm shameful, right? And when I talk about moving from the head to the heart, coming home to the heart, I'm not leaving the head behind. I'm bringing my afflictive, negative thoughts and views and notions. I'm bringing those to the heart too. I'm bringing the feelings in my gut and the feelings of shame, unworthiness, inadequacy, fear. I'm bringing those into my heart space too. I'm not holding them where they are necessarily, though I want to recognize where they are in the valley, in the body. But I'm also inviting them into the spaciousness of heart space, where I can metabolize them in a way that's healing and liberating. So freedom from addiction is the depths and horror of active addiction in my life that led to violence, incarceration, being cut off from family, to living in a car, to poverty. All of that really has just been a dharma door that's created a condition for me to find a life raft, to navigate the waters of my life in a way that where I'm growing freedom and finding a way to be able to dance through my days more and more of the time. As I practice walking meditation, if I can take one step with freedom, then I know that freedom is real and possible and here and now, and it invites another step. So this idea of radical acceptance and meeting myself in life exactly the way it is the invitation. If I want to meditate and have a meditation practice and realize that, ooh, I didn't meditate this morning, habit energy beats me up and says, what's wrong? You blew it. You're a phony. You didn't meditate. The heart says, how wonderful, you want to meditate and you missed it. So at that point, I can stop and sit for 1, 3, 5, or 20 minutes right now. Recognizing I didn't meditate is a moment of awakening and an invitation that, yes, this is something that I want to do and I can stop and do it right now. Because this is it. This moment is it. And that's where, I don't know if this is addiction, but I have a habit energy of weaponizing my care, where I care so deeply and I'm so sensitive that when things don't work out well, that I beat myself up or I put myself at odds with the world. And care is made of non-care elements, like everything. But when I choose to care, then I even want to meet the lack of care with care. This guy Stephen Levine said, when my unloving acts are friends showing me where I can be more loving. Vapai describes our unskillfulness not as a condemnation and proof of our failure and as practitioners, but unskillfulness is an invitation to grow skillfulness. It's where I'm not yet skillful. So part of this is moving from the realm of the mind, which is inherently limited and lives in poverty where there's not enough and I want more and I want different, to an embodied state of the heart of mindfulness where I'm recognizing the abundance. And there's tremendous abundance in life. And even in the saddest moments, I can recognize that I also have conditions of happiness and well-being. And not use it to bypass the sadness, but to learn to live and practice in a way where I'm holding sadness or grief in one hand and I can hold well-being in the other and remember that all is not sadness. And I'll say this, if time allows. The body and the functioning of the body is endlessly fascinating. And we think of feelings as an ultimate truth, and I find that while the manifestation of a feeling that's arisen is real, my stories that come with the feeling are not truth necessarily. So when loneliness arises, it connects in the body. I feel it in the same place in the body as every other time I've ever felt a moment of loneliness in my life. So that this moment of loneliness now becomes a tidal wave of loneliness. And the message that loneliness says is, Pete, you're lonely, you'll always be lonely. And I can say, hey, loneliness, I'm here for you. Tell me, talk to me. Well, you have a Sangha and a community, but right now you're lonely, Pete. And I can say, yes, loneliness, and right now I'm here for you. And I wasn't lonely an hour ago. So how do I care for you now? Okay. We make a movie out of a snapshot. We have a feeling, and it tells us it's the movie and the story of our life. All is grief, all is sadness, all is loss, all is loneliness. You'll always fall short. But that's not evidence of reality. And we can remember many magnificent acts of kindness and care that we've done, even if I've been unkind in one area or forgetful or rude. I can remember many acts of beauty. Even enough tolerance and of inclusiveness, even when I'm triggered and my immediate response is intolerance. So in a way, I'm very grateful to have a way of living where there is no destination. Well, even though I've arrived, I'm arriving in every moment, and where there's always more and more to learn, and where I'm always allowing the humility that I have a long way to go, and that everything I have is the benefit of the ancestral stream and the wonderful teachers and all of the conditions in my life. And at very best, I'm a thread in the fabric of life, and that I'm a human being with flaws and with attributes. And that when I can have a heartfelt belief in my own fallibility, then fallibility doesn't have to be something that is limiting and oppressive. Fallibility is an invitation. And this is how we grow connection, is by sharing vulnerably. And we make it safe. And that also, I'll add one little story. With David's death, just practicing, learning how to hold the grief, how to honor the feelings of grief as a way of honoring his life and honoring the love for him. And months after David died, I was driving in Point Loma, and I needed some time on the ocean just for the big sky, the big nature. And I was driving past the VA cemetery. And the Veterans Administration, the cemetery is row after row, endless white uniform tombstones of people who have served the country in the armed forces who have died. And I'm driving past the cemetery, looking at these endless rows of deaths, and realize that every one of those tombstones was somebody's child. Every one of those tombstones, there was somebody who loved them and missed them. And very beautifully, what I kept thinking of as my grief, the grief that afflicted me, became our grief and the shared grief. And this is where the heart of understanding opens. And I can remember that we all suffer, we're all challenged. And how to create enough space in myself by learning to show up for my suffering, to better show up for our suffering. Not to compound it, but to help transform it and be healing.
In the 12-step Zen Sangha, what is the biggest struggle in general of the people that come to the Sangha? Is there one thing that sticks out?
So I'll answer that. I think the biggest challenge that we all have, first off, is a predilection to self-obsession, to thinking about ourselves. But practically speaking, the biggest challenge is to continue to show up, to continue to show up for practice, to continue to show up for Sangha, to continue to show up for recovery, because we engage and we get benefits and we think that we've got it. And in most Sanghas, people orbit in and orbit out. We see this in Plum Village. We see this with many who become OI members and put in years of aspirancy and training and get their brown jacket and then kind of fade away. So how do we keep the flame of volition lit in ourselves? How do we keep the deep aspiration and the focus and the energy in ourselves to keep growing and to keep doing the footwork for our awakening and for our universal awakening? And Sister Dee told a story once about how when you light a candle, you light the wick, and the wick burns very brightly in the beginning because it's the cotton that's burning. But that very short time, the cotton wick burns down and begins to sputter. But the heat of the flame begins to melt the wax, And then the wax becomes fuel for the flame so that it can continue to burn and grow and glow brightly. So the question is, what is the wax in our candle? How are we nourishing the commitment? How do we maintain focus day after day, year after year? And to me, it's by showing up for the wonders of life. And it also has to do with the Bodhisattva vow, which is practicing for the benefit of all beings and continuing to show up to help for the liberation of all beings. Not as a teacher or a fixer necessarily, but by embodying a practice in that way. And in the 12th step, the language is very much the same, that having achieved some liberation, we continue to show up to help others who are suffering. And most importantly, practice spiritual principles in all of our affairs. So it's not so much, it's possibly a little bit of complacency, but comfort can be an enemy. We get benefits, and over again we see people in recovery who get clean and sober and come and be a part of and transform and get jobs and get families back and then think they've got it and that's enough. So in my experience, it's always me who's selling me short. I used to think it was the world that was holding me back, but it's me who's selling me short, and that my idea of happiness can be a limitation. As Tai said, knowledge is the greatest obstacle to spiritual growth. It's really very beautiful. Thinking that I've got it and that I've accomplished something is the greatest obstacle to continuing and going deeper and uncovering more. And this is like there's always more layers to penetrate. There's always deeper, and as Larry Ward and Peggy Ward say with the Lotus Institute, deeper, deeper still, even deeper. And that's a paraphrase. This is the gift of practice, and it keeps me impassioned. And I think maybe I was a little nervous here, but I am so passionate about the path and so passionate about recovery and so passionate about our recovery, our potential, our capacity for freedom and transformation and joy that I quite naturally want to stay focused. And that's kind of an obstacle. Many people come in, and then we find an excuse or a reason. And there's always an excuse not to go to a meeting. There's always an excuse not to go to Sangha. There's always an excuse not to sit. There's always an excuse not to go to the monastery. There's an excuse not to sit and listen to a beautiful Dharma talk. We are masters of excuses. And life is so seductive that we're easily swept away in the stream of life. So again, it is a challenge. Buddha called it swimming against the stream. And when life gets good and our hearts are open and we're much more loving and lighter people than we were, it's very easy to think that the trappings of happiness is enough. But it's not. And that's why, like Fapai shares that his teacher taught him, as a practitioner, don't get caught in the trappings of the practice, in the incense and the bells. Don't get trapped in the smiley face. Don't be afraid to feel your suffering, okay? And there's always going to be suffering, man. If we're alive in this world, if we're sensitive and aware in this world, there's always suffering. There's always going to be heartache as well as joy. And I want to be alive to every bit of it.
You shared once the deep point, finding yourself alone in the Pinot, is the car brand? Pinot?
Pinto car.
Oh, Pinto. In the Pinto car. Can you describe shortly how your life is now? You have a house. I've seen you on Zoom, so I've seen a living room at least.
I will tell you that I have a life of riches and abundance beyond my imagining. I have, and I don't, I have a wife, and it's my second wife. I've learned to care for myself. I've learned how to love others. I've learned to show up in a relationship. I've learned to raise children that were not my own. And I've learned how to divorce. I've learned how to divorce mindfully, with compassion and mindfulness. I've learned how to take a year off after the divorce to find out who I am and be in my own skin. I've learned to fall in love again and even do what I said I never would and remarry. And have two beautiful stepdaughters today. I've got a beautiful house with a garden and fruit trees. And I love my gardening. I've got avocados and persimmons and nectarines and nectarplums and all kinds of wonderful fruit. And this is my joy. And I need to take time to balance out working with people, which I do most of my days, with downtime to restore and myself, to refresh and to heal myself. So yes, I have a beautiful house, and I don't want to signify, but I have a house on the hill with a view of the bay, and I'm leasing a Tesla. So in material sense, I've got a lot of stuff, okay? But I never want to forget what it was like in the Pinot with everything I owned. And I know that this is just stuff and it's not my happiness. It's just stuff, but I'm very grateful for it. So I try and practice a lot of gratitude in action, and I practice giving. I practice supporting the monastics here. I practice giving money to the Thich Nhat Hanh Foundation as a part of not just my amends, but an expression of gratitude. I bring tea up for the monks. I work to see how I can give to our Plum Village community. And the expression of my gratitude is how I'm committed to sharing recovery and freedom from addiction. And I'll say that when I think about it, there's no way from that day in my Pinot where I knew I was going back to prison. I had felonies, and there was no hope for not going back. And I was broke in mind and body and spirit. And somehow, by cleaning up and doing the right thing for the right reason, I didn't go back to prison. I was given a reprieve. And I was unemployed and unemployable. I had been a jazz musician for many years and lost my instruments as an addict and didn't want to go back to the jazz life because it was bars and drugs. And I just followed my nose and I did the next indicated action and took a horrible job to a less horrible job, to a job in a warehouse, an electronics distributor that led to doing sales when everybody was sick with the flu. And then they thought I was such a good salesman. I became a salesperson selling electronic components, not hustling, but what people need, and was making so much money that I could buy a house. And then liver disease came in. And suffering with liver disease and the horrible medications they had for that back in the day, I lost my job and wound up finding a new career, breeding rare reptiles, which is just another fluke story about my stepson wanted to bring home a snake he caught and talked us into letting him keep it, and he couldn't care for it. And I became fascinated with snakes and coming home, and really it's like using the other side of the brain, watching them. So one snake became two snakes, and common snakes became rare snakes. And the next thing you knew, my house was full of rare monitor lizards and snakes. And when I lost the job selling electronics, all of these snakes were breeding. And I did as well financially breeding these rare reptiles as I did with a straight job. How? Just because I loved it and I was doing what I loved with love. okay? I became the second one in the world to breed these rare dwarf monitor lizards. And it's not because I'm smart or trained, I'm not. I knew how to be mindfully present and let them tell me what they need, even if it was counterintuitive. And eventually I was so sick that I had to let go of the reptile business. But I believe in abundance. And one of my mentors, a man named Buckminster Fuller, told me that if we are doing the right thing for the right reason, we will be provided for. And this is the Sangha's experience, as the Sangha's provided for, because it doesn't really have a money-making business, but it's provided for because it's grounded in spiritually wholesome right action. And I've been provided for. So there's no logical way to get from living in my pinto with that depths of despair to where I am today, other than just being in each moment and trying to do the right thing for the right reason and remaining teachable. So the bottom with drugs, the bottom I hit emotionally with grief, with David's death and other death. And listen, the more involved I am with people, the more I'm going to care and the more devastating deaths I'm going to experience. Recently, ties. But I engage coming and going in freedom. This is what Thai taught us. We can come and go with freedom. We can engage with the grief with freedom also. We can use the grief not as something that's limiting us, but something as an invitation to say what we most want to say instead of thinking there may be another chance or it's not important. To express appreciation, to express gratitude, to be vulnerable. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Pete. Thank you very much. Thank you for your volition, for your path, and for your sharing.
When I come to Deer Park, I am happy because I have learned to look deeply.
Letting sunlight come shine through my leaves. And you said, let me die so you can live. So much joy you have to give. Remember, child, whatever you do, will always love you.